LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, AI is going to revolutionize education. Are we ready for it?
I started getting chills because it was able to not just answer a question, it was able to explain why, and an AP level biology question, why that answer worked, why the other answers didn't work. It was clear that this was the moment where AI was getting good enough to start to approximate some of what we thought was only the domain of a tutor.
Can you imagine having a tutor that knows not only all the world's information, but everything that you know and don't, all the gaps in your knowledge? A tutor that is endlessly patient, always there, familiar with the best teaching techniques. A tutor that's funny, a tutor that can give you generous counsel on how to focus, how to clear your mind of the concerns and anxieties that clutter it. A tutor that can explain what information is most useful to accomplish the things you hope to accomplish. This tutor is coming. It may have already arrived. It's powered by artificial intelligence, and it will soon be available to everyone on the planet. These are the good tidings coming from my guest today, Sal Khan. Sal is the founder of Khan Academy, the education nonprofit that has consistently leveraged the latest technologies to teach over 140 million students in more than 50 languages. He's out with a brand new book, Brave New Words: How AI Will Revolutionize Education, and why that's a good thing. Sal's thesis is relatively simple. Personal tutoring is extremely effective, but it's historically only been available to the wealthy. AI is now, today, an exceptional personal tutor, and it will only get better. This has the potential to be a game changer, making tailored, self-paced, focused conversational education available to everyone on the planet in the coming decades. This won't replace teachers, according to Sal. AIs will keep parents and teachers apprised of each student's progress, suggest grades, and make classrooms more effective. There is a pathway here that is as tantalizing as it is disquieting. We can imagine an AI that is the perfect tutor, that knows how we learn, what we know, what we don't, that summons all the world's knowledge to make us better thinkers, better friends, better spouses, better compensated, more satisfied. In the process, as both a guide and an agent acting on our behalf, it will report to our teachers, and maybe in the future our prospective employers, about our strengths and weaknesses, what we know and what we don't. Our most trusted advisor will become, potentially, the gatekeeper of our opportunities. So here's the question we're going to answer on today's show. If AI tutors are coming, and Sal believes they are, in fact, he's already building them in a partnership with OpenAI, will these Socratic bots help us rise to our potential, or will they define our limitations? Sal, as you're about to hear, is unabashedly optimistic. The key, he says, is to approach AI development with the right intentions. Because, he says, technology just amplifies human intentions. It always has.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by Twilio. Twilio believes good listening is good business. That's why they're helping brands build more intelligent voice experiences with Twilio Voice API. Visit twilio.com/voice to learn more.
Sal Khan, welcome to The Next Big Idea.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for that overly generous introduction.
You are best known as the founder of Khan Academy, which has provided free education to over 140 million users in 190 countries. You've had a lifelong interest in education, and more specifically, how we could use technology to improve how we learn. And this was news to me. You've also had a lifelong interest in artificial intelligence. You studied with Marvin Minsky and others at MIT. And these two interests of yours are converging right now in the use of AI to help humans learn. Is this an exciting moment for you? It seems like the world has conspired to pull all your interests together.
Yes, to put it simply, it's exciting, it's scary, it's all of the above, as you mentioned. And I started the last chapter saying, I have a confession. I used to want to be an AI researcher. When I went to MIT back in 1994, that's what I thought I wanted to do. I sought out Henry Patrick Winston, who was one of the leaders. He was the founder of the, or he led at the time, the MIT AI laboratory. He was my advisor. I took classes with Marvin Minsky. But at the time, AI was, interesting, but it wasn't doing amazing things. And my life took on one track or another. It's interesting because a lot of folks, the founding of Khan Academy, and I oftentimes cite when I started tutoring my cousins and word spreads in my family, free tutoring's going on, and I start using technology to help scale some of that tutoring. But some classmates of mine from college just unearthed a time capsule that we wrote in 1998. And it turns out that I said that I wanted to start a school at some point, and that several folks in my dormitory thought that I was going to start a school. So I must have been talking about it back then. So my two interests were, my interest was intelligence, human intelligence and artificial intelligence.
Right.
But I've always thought about how can you increase human potential? I've always been fascinated by that.
Right. And the sense that in order to understand human intelligence, maybe the best way to do it is to build an intelligence, right? Which is what drew a lot of people early on to artificial intelligence. And now finally we've hit this inflection point. I was amazed by a passage in your book where you describe a interview you did with Computer World magazine in 1999. You were just barely out of college and they were doing a cover story on the new millennium. And you were quoted as saying that you predicted that we would have a future in which, quote, we would all have artificially intelligent personal agents to represent us in cyberspace. The agents would purchase things for you and broker transactions, even matchmake between employers and employees or romantic partners, right? So your 20-year time horizon there didn't quite pan out, but it's been quite astonishing in the last few years to see. I mean, that now feels rather prescient as a statement.
It's funny, and I write about this in the book when, I was this 21 or 22-year-old, the editor-in-chief of Computer World magazine reaches out to me. He happened to be at my graduation at MIT and said, and I was class president, so I gave a little speech. So it was like, let me throw that kid into the mix. And so I was like, this is my big opportunity. Let me do something bold. And so I wrote almost like the boldest ideas that I could put there. And you're absolutely right. Fast forward 20 years, this was supposed to be like the next 10 or 20 years, the new millennium. Those things did not happen. But if you fast forward 24 years, not only are those things on the precipice of happening, but they're going to happen in a deeper way than I could have ever predicted in the late 90s.
Well, your new book, Brave New Words, is the most optimistic take on the future impact of AI on our lives that I've read. And I think education, along with maybe medicine and clean tech, are the most exciting use cases for AI. And of course, you also acknowledge that AI will present problems. We'll discuss those. But let's begin with a little bit of history on how our education system got to where it is today. And you know something about this because you wrote a book about it, The One World Schoolhouse. And it's easy to forget that not long ago, most people were illiterate. Could you tell us a little bit about how we arrived at our current education system, which you refer to as the factory model of education?
I remind myself and everyone that the education system that we now just assume is normal has not been there for most of human history. For most of human history, we were learning non-academic things. We were learning to hunt. We were learning to cook. We were learning to build shelters. And that we learned through some form of mentorship, apprenticeship. You fast forward to let's say the last 2,000 or 3,000 years. And this is when we started to really develop academic knowledge. We started as a society to think that at least the learned in our societies, the leaders, the priests, should know how to read. They should know how to do arithmetic. They should know how to do accounting to manage a state. But very few people got that education. Most folks, to your point, couldn't read. I've looked this up. Even in Western Europe, before the Renaissance, at best, you're looking at about 20-25% of men could read. Women, you're looking at more like 10 or 15% at the time. But then you fast forward to the 18th to 19th centuries. We start having the Industrial Revolution. And out of that comes a very utopian idea, if you really think about it in hindsight. It's like, well, what if we take this academic learning and we make it free for everyone? We create mass public education. We want everyone to be able to read. We want everyone to be able to do algebra.
It was a radical idea at the time.
Hugely radical idea, and it's paid huge dividends. It's no coincidence that the first societies to invest here also ended up being the first societies that had a broad-based middle class. I'm thinking about Prussia. I'm thinking about the United States. I'm thinking about the UK. I'm thinking about Japan. They were the first societies to have mass public education, and they were the first to also have a broad middle class and also industrialize. And, one led to the other. Industrialization led to more resources that you could put into education, and education led to better industrialization, better workforce. We had to make compromises, though. Even with the bounty of the Industrial Revolution, we still do not have the resources, and we still don't, to give every student an Aristotle, to give everyone a personal tutor. But in the Industrial Revolution, we said, well, okay, how do we produce things at scale? Well, we batch things together. We move them together to set pace on an assembly line, if you will.
Right.
We come up with some standards. We figure out some ways to assess the product according to those standards. And then maybe some of the product is going to be really high quality, and then that's going to go into one lane, and some of it, mid-quality, not quite sticking, that's going to go someplace else. We did the same thing in education. We batched kids together, usually by age, set standards. Let's say there's a test on exponents in 7th grade. You get a 90%, I get a 70%. Even though it identified gaps in both of our knowledge, the whole class moves on to the next concept, probably something that builds on those gaps. Some kids are going to be able to keep up, but other kids are starting to fall by the wayside. This is what I saw with my cousins. This is what we've seen in Khan Academy with now hundreds of millions of students, and we work with teachers in classrooms. Even though mass public education has done so much good, we still see that actually a majority of students aren't optimally served by this. A majority of kids who graduate from high school, actually who go to college in the United States, when they take an assessment at the college says you're not even ready to learn algebra yet. So even though they've taken all of these courses, the assembly line was moving them through courses like algebra and geometry and algebra 2. They go to college saying, hey, none of this was sticking. We're going to take you back to 7th grade. So there is a problem. Now, if I was saying this 50 years ago, you'd be like, well, we still don't have the resources to give everyone a personal tutor or to give every teacher a teaching assistant. But that's where technology maybe allows us to resolve this tension a bit.
And in the last 40 years, we've had this computing revolution. How much progress on solving this problem of improving upon the sort of factory model of education do you think we've made in the last 40 years? Do you think it's gotten much better or incrementally better?
It depends who you ask and who you're trying to serve. I think if you are a reasonably motivated learner who at least has some basic ingredients, you have an internet connection, you have a reasonable device, you're off to the races now. There's nothing to stop you from learning anything that you need to learn. So in the last 20 years, you do have a reality where whether it's Khan Academy or YouTube or other sources, obviously Khan Academy is much more than videos. We have exercises, we have teacher tools, but someone can methodically learn at their own pace. Or if they're in a classroom and something wasn't making sense, they can get that on-demand help to fill in that gap. And we are seeing, there's been over 50 efficacy studies on students using Khan Academy in classrooms where teachers are able to let students go at their own pace. And those students are accelerating by 20, 30, 40%, depending on the research you look at. The problem is we don't still see that mainstream. And so in this next phase, I think artificial intelligence will allow us to go that much further. It'll allow us to support even more students. It'll allow us to support even teachers more than we were with pre-AI technology. But there's also going to be a lot of system change and professional development and other things we do to make sure that these tools get out there and they're used well.
So you've been making this case now for a long time. Your book, The One World Schoolhouse, came out 12 years ago. And you were making the case then that we need to help students learn at their own pace, fully master subjects before moving on to the next. Teachers should be more mentors and facilitators. Classes should be more interactive and less about delivering lectures. Now we finally have this tool in artificial intelligence, which is now also live on the Khan Academy platform in the form of K-Migo, which I've been playing with. I've decided I never quite grokked pre-calculus or calculus. So I've decided it's not too late, Sal. I think I can. So I've signed up, but I'm in there. But you point out that Alexander the Great was tutored by Aristotle. Aristotle, in turn, was tutored by Plato, and Plato, in turn, was tutored by Socrates, right? So there's some pretty impressive historical examples of tutoring. Do we have credible evidence today that one-on-one tutoring is the most effective way to learn? And it seems like a core thesis of your book is, if so, AI is going to deliver this on a massive scale.
I think we do, but I'll modify it slightly where I think it's more about personalization, whether it's one-on-one or not, which is being able to address exactly what the student needs in the moment. And I'll tell you the evidence that I anchor on. I gave a TED Talk a little over a year ago where I anchored on Benjamin Bloom's 2 Sigma study, where he made an argument that if you had one-on-one personalization in a mastery framework, which he defined as, hey, if a student hasn't learned something well yet, they should be able to keep working on that. You only got 70% of exponents, keep working on basic exponents so that when you get to logarithms or negative exponents, things make a little bit more sense. What he was arguing is that you could get 2 standard deviation improvement. You could take a student who was performing in the 50th percentile, and with that type of personalized mastery learning, they could get to essentially the 95th or the 96th percentile. Or you could start with a student who's well below average and get to a student who's well above average. The other evidence is, I think this is intuitive. If you look at anyone who is great at what they're doing, you look at a great athlete, you look at a great musician. I don't think there is a great athlete that did not have some form of personalized one-on-one coaching. LeBron James did not become LeBron James purely based on genetics and talent. Someone would say, hey, you're really great at driving to the basket. You need to work on your 3-pointers more, or you need to work on your defense more. Let's do that right now. He wasn't sitting day after day listening to lectures about basketball in a group of 30 with people saying, okay, now let's everyone for homework practice your free throws. You're not going to get maximum results. Similar, any great musician, you will only learn that well is if you sit down. In fact, the standard practice of learning a musical instrument is to have a weekly one-on-one session with someone who's going to see where you're strong, where you're weak, going to give you feedback, and then say, now go practice, and then come back the next week. So I think there's the research evidence is strong, but I think even more obviously, the intuitive evidence is very strong. And I saw this also with my own cousins. That first cousin I was tutoring, Nadia, back in 2004, she was struggling in math. With a little bit of support, after 2 or 3 months, she became one of the top students in her class.
This, by the way, for listeners who aren't familiar with it, is the origin story of Khan Academy. That here you were, a young hedge fund analyst, right, and discovered that your cousin needed some help with math, and you got in there, and you want to share that?
No, that's exactly right. It was 2004, almost exactly 20 years ago. I was a year out of business school. My original background was in tech, but I now found myself as an analyst at a hedge fund. I had just gotten married. I was living in Boston and got married in New Jersey. My family from New Orleans, I was born and raised in New Orleans, was visiting me in Boston, and it came out of conversation. My 12-year-old cousin Nadia was having trouble in math. I offered to tutor her remotely. She agrees. And it works for her. She gets caught up with her class, a little ahead of her class. I joke, at that point, I became a tiger cousin. I call up her school. I said, she should be able to take that placement test from last year. They said, who are you? I said, I'm her cousin. They let her. And she became one of the top students in her class in math. So word spreads in my family. Free tutoring is going on. Before I know it, I'm tutoring 10, 15 cousins, family, friends. And I saw this pattern. The reason they were struggling wasn't because they didn't have access to great teachers or schools, wasn't because they weren't hardworking. It was because they had accumulated gaps in this traditional factory model where they're just being pushed ahead, or they might have forgotten some of the things that even when they did get an A the first time, they just forgot some of those skills. Then I saw that, hey, I was having to explain the same things over and over again. It was hard to schedule. I started making YouTube videos for my family. This was on a friend's suggestion. And my cousin's family told me they like me better on YouTube than in person. What they were saying, was they liked me being in their life as a coach, as a mentor, but it was really valuable to have an on-demand version. Right in the moment when they're doing their homework at 11 p.m., they could just access it. They didn't have to feel shame that they might have need review from something from elementary school. They could pause, repeat. It was infinitely patient. And so if you think about everything that Khan Academy's done since then, and Khan Academy is much more than me now, by 2008 or on the order of 100,000 folks using it. And that's when I set it up as a nonprofit with the mission of free world-class education for anyone, anywhere. But ever since then, the reason why I thought free world-class education for anyone, anywhere isn't delusional is because there are now technological tools like the internet, like software, like on-demand video, and now AI that might allow us to scale the type of personalization that I was able to do at Nadia to hopefully hundreds of millions or billions of students. So that's to some degree our true north, and also provide tools to support teachers, because I still think they're a very important role here. To that point, that my cousins like the YouTube videos, but if I wasn't there mentoring them, they would have disengaged. So I think there's another very important role there of how do you also maximally inform and engage teachers in the process.
So you've been really focused on how we can use technology to improve education for a long time now. You've had a thesis about the importance of personalized learning at the right pace for a given student. You also, as we know, had this interest in college and beyond in artificial intelligence, and you get an incoming call from OpenAI, right? From I don't know if it was directly from Greg Brockman, but you ended up, I think, sitting down with Greg Brockman, who co-founder and president of OpenAI, to get an early peek at GPT-4, right? And they expressed an interest in partnering with you. What was that like with the first time you saw GPT-4 and what it could do?
Yeah, and this was summer of 2022. It was an email from Sam Altman and Greg Brockman. They said, look, we are about to finish training our next model. We think this is the model that's going to really open people's eyes to what's possible with AI. And that's going to be both exciting and scary. And we want to lead, we OpenAI want to lead with social positive use cases from organizations that folks trust with the technical capability to take advantage of it. And they said the first people we thought of was education and Khan Academy. And I was initially a little bit skeptical. I thought I had seen what GPT-2 and 3 were capable of. Very cool from a technological point of view, but still didn't seem like it could reason, so to speak, or it could really make sense of the information. So it didn't seem ready for what we were doing at Khan Academy. But I was curious. We had that meeting. You know, when I saw, and this was months before ChatGPT existed, and even ChatGPT, it's important to keep in mind, was based on an older model, not GPT-4. What they were showing me was GPT-4, and I think I might have been the first person outside of OpenAI to see it. I started getting chills because it was able to not just answer a question, it was able to explain why, and an AP level biology question, why that answer worked, why the other answers didn't work. And I started seeing that you could prompt it to really act as a strong Socratic tutor. It was obvious even then that it could be used for cheating, but what if you prompt the AI in the right way so it won't cheat and it can Socratically drive a conversation? And it wasn't hard to at least make it do that in a rough way. Now, there was issues. It still made a lot of math errors. It still would sometimes completely fabricate facts. But it was clear that this was the moment where AI was getting good enough to start to approximate some of what we thought was only the domain of a tutor or only the domain of a teaching assistant, because there's also power in writing lesson plans or potentially grading papers or writing progress reports. And so that's when Khan Academy, and it was top secret. We couldn't tell anyone. We started working really deeply on it.
And so since then, you have rolled out K-Migo, which is now among its many important uses, trying to help me with my pre-calculus, my high school pre-calculus remedial education. How good do you think it is? Does every child today have access to their own Aristotle? Where do you think we are in the evolution of the AI tutor?
I think we're already at a place. We launched K-Migo in March of 2023. And now we have on the order of 100,000 users on it. By this coming back to school, this coming fall, we're going to have approaching 1 million folks on it. What we're seeing is for students who are engaged in their learning and who have a question or are stuck on a concept, it's already very, very, very powerful. So if you're learning pre-calculus and you're like, wait, when I take a square root, is it plus or minus 1, or is it just the positive square root? What is it? If you have these edge case type of questions, it's already very, very powerful. If you're watching a Khan Academy video and you're like, well, what about this? Very, very powerful. I used it recently preparing for a video where, I know a reasonable amount, more than the average person, about cosmology, but I always had a gap in my understanding. I was like, well, why do supernovas explode? You would think that when a star is of a certain mass and the fusion stops, it would just collapse. And so I go on K-Migo and I say, why does a supernova explode? K-Migo doesn't just, if I did that on ChatGPT, it would just give me like a Wikipedia type answer. And I wasn't finding those Wikipedia type answers satisfying on the broader internet. But K-Migo instead says, well, can you explain what a supernova is to me? And so I said, okay. I wrote, well, it's when a star of a certain mass runs out of fuel for fusion. And so the fusion stops. And then I wrote, well, so why, if the fusion's stopping, that outward force that is going to stop, so wouldn't the star just collapse due to all that gravity and all of that mass? And K-Migo told me, well, your intuition is pretty solid. But let me ask you a question. Let me ask you, Sal, a question. Do you think it's going to collapse quickly or slowly? And I said, well, I think it'll collapse pretty quickly because it doesn't happen to any star. It has to be a star of a certain mass. And then K-Migo says, well, have you ever seen anything collapse or fall quickly without bouncing? And I said, oh, so you're telling me that it collapses so much pressure that it actually squeezes the atomic and subatomic particles together. And then you have a rebound, kind of like a spring, and then it jettisons the outer atmosphere of the star. And then K-Migo says, exactly. So it's very powerful for things like for things like that. Like, I don't think I could have gotten a better explanation or a better tutoring session, even if I'd called one of my friends who are, PhDs in cosmology. The places where we are continuing to work to improve K-Migo there still are a lot of students that, for whatever reason, they've kind of disengaged from their learning. They need someone to be on them a little bit to even engage. And so this is where the teacher will always be crucial. Parents are always going to be crucial, but we're working on ways. We call this project internally proactive K-Migo. If you think about when I was tutoring my cousins, I would say about 30% of the work I was doing with my cousins was unblocking them conceptually. Like, this is what factoring polynomials mean, or this is how you can visualize this. But the other 60, 70% was me motivating them, me getting annoying with them, me calling them up and saying, where are you? How come you haven't done your problems? Me calling up their mom, saying, advocating for them. Like, hey, they got to, if they're falling behind in math, I don't care how many sports they play, they're going to have it, they're going to be in trouble. So we're looking at ways that the AI can do that as well.
As you know, many teachers and parents have a lot of fears when it comes to the intersection of AI and education. And I think probably the first fear that comes to mind is this concern about cheating. Because even though K-Migo may engage in a kind of Socratic process of challenging the student to learn, a lot of kids might just sort of go straight to GPT-4 to get the essay produced quickly. How do we address this problem of AI offering a kind of shortcut that can prevent our kids from learning?
Even before AI, what was the state of cheating? It turns out that it was pretty rampant, and it is pretty rampant. Kids are getting their fraternity brothers, sorority sisters to write papers. There are services on the internet that are happy to hire someone in Nigeria who's a PhD in English to write your paper for you for $5 a page. So it's kind of like, real life GPT of people and, guaranteed A- or better type of thing. So this was already pretty rampant. In a lot of ways, ChatGPT coming on the scene just put a spotlight on it and in some ways leveled the playing field for cheating. You didn't have to pay the $5 per page anymore. But at first I was really worried because when all of that came out and a bunch of school districts started banning ChatGPT, I was like, oh, they're going to throw out the baby with the bathwater. It doesn't have to be this way. And so what we built on K-Migo, to your point, not only won't cheat for you, it will support the student, it'll act as a great writing coach, but we also are building it so it can undermine other forms of cheating, not just AI cheating, but even I'm going to talk to my sorority sister cheating, or I'm going to hire someone in Nigeria to write my paper for me cheating. And the way we're doing that is you work on the essay with the AI, and then the AI can report back to the teacher, not just the final output of the essay, but the entire process. And not just the entire process, like, hey, here's our whole transcript. We worked on it for 4.5 hours. Here's some themes. Sal had some trouble with the thesis statement. We eventually got there. And by the way, this is consistent with Sal's other work. It's consistent with the work that he's done in class. I'm confident, the AI, am confident that this is Sal's work. If Sal goes to ChatGPT or gets an essay from some other place, the AI is going to say, well, first of all, we didn't really work on this together. It only took half an hour. And this isn't consistent with Sal's other work. I would double check what's going on here.
Your message, it seems to me, is, look, AI is here. and it's going to be more and more present in our lives. The options available to us are to resist AI or accept what it offers us, all the possible benefits, and adapt. And given these options, adaptation is clearly the better path. But it does seem to me that there is a loss, and I think of as somebody who loves the written language, and I end up in my own household functioning, I guess, as like a chat GPT because my kids and spouse often ask me to help adjust, improve upon emails or essays or whatever. But there is a sense that words have an intimacy about them, that words are revealing, whether you're reading a text message or an email or a book, that the words on a page are kind of an artifact of someone's thinking. And I personally was fine with computers like correcting our spelling and our grammar, and then even our facts, right? Because we could have now access to all the world's facts. But this notion that soon we might even see people, getting suggestions on how to write a better text message on the fly from AI, that we're moving towards a world where writing, it seems to me, is becoming a mediated form, right? We have to think about the written text in a different way. And the message I'm getting reading your book is, yes, there may be a loss there, but there are also a lot of benefits, and we need on some level just to make peace with the idea that we will be collaborating with AIs to be more efficient, more effective, and it means that our relationship with writing is going to be different. Is that fair?
I think that's reasonably fair. I can't predict exactly how it's all going to net out at the end of the day, but in the book and in interviews like this, I offer a slightly different viewpoint, which is well before ChatGPT came on the scene. I know some very senior folks at some universities who've all complained to me, and some of these are some of the top universities in the world, that even their freshmen can't write anymore. This is before ChatGPT existed. And I've theorized with some of them why this is happening, and most of us think it's because writing has been taken out of most curricula. If you go to a really good preparatory school, they're still doing a lot of writing, but in most schools, they're not doing anywhere near as much writing as we probably were when we were in school. The best reason I can think of why is because we've had to move to a standardized assessment. I have a whole other chapter on standardized assessment. I'm not anti-standardized assessment. Anyone who is, I'm like, which part do you not like, the standardized or the assessment part? But standardized assessment, by its very nature, they had to make some compromises. It kind of goes back to like the design of schools. They said, well, we have to administer to everyone. It has to be standardized. Oh, it'll be multiple choice. It's hard to make a standardized, open-ended, I want you to write in a blue book type of assessment. The problem is when you did that, and schools and teachers started to index on those scores a lot more from those standardized assessments. They didn't just view it as part of a holistic education, but they viewed it as like the marker of whether kids are learning. Then they're like, okay, well, how much the kids are writing in class isn't necessarily correlating a lot, so we'll take those things out. And actually, even outside of the standardized test, it was also very expensive to do writing in class. I just met a teacher, 7th grade teacher, teaches 6 classes of 30 kids. Can you imagine? She asks those kids to write a report on The Great Gatsby. And on a weekend, she could have 180 papers to grade over that weekend. Like if you just told me that's all I had to do for the next month, I would say, no, that's too much work for me. So even for a teacher who wants to do writing, it's incredibly resource intensive. And then think about from the student's point of view, by the time they get the paper back, the class has moved on to another thing. They don't have a chance to revise. They don't have that support, et cetera. So that's the current state. That's before we have AI. Now, you introduce AI, yes, there are worlds where kids are going to go to ChatGPT and do shortcuts. Now, as I said, even before AI, they were finding other shortcuts. But now AI introduces a world where maybe in a standardized way, you can reintroduce open-ended responses into tests. You can introduce even the blue book back into tests. AIs can actually understand people's handwriting. They can understand their open-ended work in math or a diagram they draw, or if they wanted to write out an essay with their penmanship. That is now doable. And so does the future of assessment actually become much richer now because of AI? And now that will be a motivation to do more rich, open-ended writing type activities in the classroom. And by the way, those things can not have to be as expensive and as heavy as they used to be because now students can get more support. The AI is not doing it for them, but the AI is supporting them while they're outlining and doing thesis statements and giving them feedback that normally would have taken weeks to get. And the teacher can get more insights. They can get preliminary grades based on a rubric, things like that, so that the teacher says, hey, I can have kids write an essay every week. And the kids themselves feel more supported in writing that essay. And by the way, essay writing is now part of the standardized tests again. This is a world where I think we are doing more writing and we're becoming better writers, better communicators.
Interesting. But the writing that you're describing is happening in the classroom. I mean, this idea of going home and producing an essay and that being graded becomes a little more complicated. And also, as you point out, this idea that an essay is a critical part of your application to college and reference letters are critical to your application to college becomes problematic.
We know for a fact, well before AI came on the scene, affluent kids were paying college admissions coaches out here in Silicon Valley or in places like New York. The going rate is $400 to $500 an hour. So these kids, their families are paying someplace between $10,000 and $50,000 for these folks to sit with their kids, give them feedback on their essays. The ethical ones are just giving feedback and coaching. The unethical ones are writing the essays for the kids. That's the current state of what's going on. And when I talk to heads of admissions, some of them kind of recognize it. Some of them, I think, are still a little oblivious to how unfair this has been before. And now with ChatGPT, it kind of levels the playing field. I actually think the right way to go is to create other artifacts other than writing for something that's as important as college admissions. I think we can go into a world where you could have a video interview with students. They can create video artifacts. That's harder to fake. And it's real time. It's not like something that's edited and all of this. You know, you just show up and maybe an AI is involved in asking you questions to follow up on the questions that what you said to dig deep. Maybe it can, and I know there's a lot of fears, and I have fears too about bias, et cetera, et cetera. But as I point out in the book, I guarantee you the person who's looking through those admissions, they're trying not to be biased, but they are. And it's impossible to be perfectly unbiased. But I think there's actually ways of using this tool to actually reduce bias as opposed to amplify bias. So, you know, my encouragement, I don't want to sound like an AI apologist. I know I kind of am sounding like that right now because I think there's a lot of issues to work through. But the reality is that a lot of these problems have existed for a very long time and people have been ignoring them. And AI just put a spotlight on them. And the good news is it can also provide some solutions to these problems.
Now, your comment about the ability of the AI to reduce cheating by basically collaborating with a student and keeping teachers and parents apprised along the way about how the student is progressing. And if the student then goes out and, you know, uses GPT-4 to write an essay, the AI can say, hey, this is not something the student worked on with me. This does not seem consistent with their other writing. You also talk about perhaps the AI suggesting a grade. Like this feels like a B+ paper. Perhaps with these modifications, we could get it to an A-. So the AI tutor in this scenario you're describing is becoming both this kind of nuanced, endlessly patient, incredibly supportive tutor, but also part of the evaluation process, right? Of assessing progress and even potentially giving grades. Is that what you see likely happening?
It is going to happen. And I know as soon as you go into grading, there's a lot of fears like, hey, will this have biases? Will this? And I think those are legitimate fears. And what I say is I think it's impossible to remove all bias, but the standard isn't to be bias free. The standard is, can you be more consistent and less biased than the status quo? And I guarantee you, no matter how superhuman someone is, if you're grading 180 papers, how you're thinking about the 179th paper versus the second paper is going to be very different. And so as an educator, I think I would appreciate, I still would love to be in charge, and I think that's very important, but I would love a second set of eyes that can look at the rubric and maybe a rubric that I created with the AI and say, you know, based on this dimension, it's a 4 out of 5. Based on this dimension, it's a 5 out of 5. And by the way, you know, here's the evidence why.
You know, I find myself feeling torn between, on the one hand, this incredible excitement about how amazing this can be and maybe is likely to be. The idea that you would have a tutor that could say, hey, you've now written a B+ level essay, and maybe you're happy with that. If you want to work for another 45 minutes with me on it, I bet we can get it to an A- or whatever. I could see that being deeply gratifying and certainly resulting in dramatically accelerated learning. So that to me is the upside scenario. Does that resonate for you? I mean, do you see that happening?
No, that's exactly it. And I definitely could imagine a reality where we have a lot of the downside scenarios as well. But what I tell everyone is you really have 2 or 3 options here. Like the AI is here. It's a technology. Any technology is an amplification of human intent. We know there's a lot of bad intent out there. There's going to be people who use this technology for misinformation, for fraud, for a lot of bad things. I am genuinely worried about all of that, including national security. I'm also worried about it amplifying lazy intent. And we know a lot of kids can want to cut corners sometimes, and they will. And people, for better or for worse, there are companies that are more than happy to create AI tools that amplify this lazy intent because they know that there's a market there. So the question is, do all of us that have positive intent, who really want kids to learn, do we run away from the technology and let the lazy and the bad actors win? Or do we do something about it? And I say it's irresponsible to not do something about it. Yes. And I'm also confident that if we move forward, part of the process of this book is for me to think through all of these and talk to other people who are thinking it through and say, like, you know what? Yes, there are some real issues where kids could cut corners or where bad actors can do bad things. But if we're creative about it, there's ways to not only undermine those things, those bad use cases, but there's ways to support positive use cases that we didn't think were possible 30 or 40 years ago. And so that is very exciting.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. In the last 100 years, we've seen financial markets swing, new currencies come and go, decades of savings lost in days, all showing that a retirement plan without a guarantee, quite simply, isn't enough. So more than a retirement plan, TIAA makes you a retirement promise. A promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. A promise that pays off. Learn more at TIAA.org/promisespayoff.
Hey, friends. I want to take a moment to thank you for listening to this podcast. We love making it, and because you listen, and maybe even tell your friends now and then, we get to do this every week. One of the things I love about making this podcast is that it forces me to read a lot of books. Let's be honest, way more than I would otherwise. It's been fascinating, and it's really impacted my life in measurable ways. I have an idea for you. Why don't you join me and Caleb and Michael and all the members of the Next Big Idea team in reading 2 books each season? Not just any books, but the very best books of the year, according to our 4 extraordinary curators, Malcolm Gladwell, Susan Cain, Adam Grant, and Daniel Pink, who select our 8 books a year. You will receive 2 books per quarter, and like me, you will have pre-committed to a year of reading. Just go to nextbigideaclub.com and use promo code PODCAST to save 20%. Then we'll look forward to discussing these books with you in the Next Big Idea community. To go a little deeper on the sort of the downside scenarios, I can also see that when you have an AI tutor who also at some point is becoming a really effective psychologist, a counselor, even a friend to some degree, at some point it gets a little big brothery, right? Because you have this relationship with this entity that's helping you learn and expand your cognitive horizons, but that's also a gatekeeper, potentially keeping you out of the college you dream of attending. And I could also imagine AI tutors, if AI tutors can assess our cognitive abilities, couldn't they also assess character, predict the probability of future antisocial behavior, law breaking? There's an element of surveillance, right? When you develop this intimate relationship with an entity that has very deep knowledge of you and some degree of power over your future.
Yeah, and I agree. And you have to be very careful with those things. But I will restate that these are not new issues to AI. There's a lot that gets projected onto kids by human beings today. And, I think all of us can cite the many people in our lives who believed in us and helped us believe in ourselves. But I think we can also find, especially folks who struggled in life, many of them will be able to tell you people, sometimes family members, sometimes folks in the education system who told them that they weren't going to amount to something. So I think those types of things have always been there. And once again, there's no way to really audit that. There's no transparency. So I think the developers, the positive developers of AI who want positive intent, we should be very aware of these things. But the good news is that we can show the world, how are we testing for bias? How are we making sure that depending on a kid's ethnicity or last name or gender, it's not giving two different answers when everything else is equivalent? And that's hard to do in the real world. But you can actually do that with something like, something that's scalable, like you can put 50 different resumes that are all the same, except in maybe the name or the gender or et cetera, and see whether the AI evaluates them all the same. It's very hard to do that with a human admissions officer or a human coach. So I definitely hear those, but I don't think those are, once again, reasons to run away. Those are just reasons to be careful as you move forward.
Yeah. You are describing a future in which humans and teachers and parents are very much at the center of this process, right? And there are some people who worry that AI could replace teachers. You disagree. You don't see that as a likely outcome.
Yeah, I strongly disagree. One area I'm very confident, it's hard to predict the future, but I think any role that is very human driven, that is about human relationships, I think those are very, not only safe in an AI world, but I think they're going to be more valued and more empowered in an AI world. I've said this from the beginning of Khan Academy. If I had to pick between an amazing teacher and no technology, or amazing technology and no teacher, I would pick the amazing teacher every time, for my own children and by extension for anyone's children. Now, the ideal is to have both. Take that amazing teacher and empower them so they don't have to spend as much time writing lesson plans, grading papers, writing progress reports. Empower them so that all of their 30 students or 180 students, if they have 6 class periods of 30 kids, get support when they need the support and are able to report back to the teacher where all of those students are. Have more support in writing exams, getting insights from those exams. And so then the teacher gets liberated to put more of their time and energy, one, for themselves, because teachers are getting burnt out because they're so spread thin, but then also more time and energy to be able to form those really important human connections with their students, do more focused small group interventions, be able to reach every student where they are. So I've always believed this, and I think this is going to be even more the case. Just yesterday, we announced that we're giving away, even though it's very computationally intensive, it costs a lot of resources. It's because of a partnership with Microsoft that we announced that we're able to do this. We're giving away all these very powerful teacher tools, AI-based teacher tools, to every teacher in the United States and hopefully internationally shortly after that, so that they can have that time back and really amplify the human element of the job, which I think is indispensable.
Let's talk about AI and creativity. Some people, as you know, are dismissive of the creative potential of AIs, or maybe alarmed that creative AIs will replace human creativity. You quote Noam Chomsky in the book, who talks about the elegance of the human mind and refers to AI in contrast as inferring brute correlations between data points. Do you think this is too dismissive of the creativity of AI, or maybe are we too romantic about our own creative capabilities?
As I argue in the book, it is a little bit of both. I think we might think that we're a little bit magical and that AIs are a little bit less magical than maybe they are. When what we call human creativity, it is almost never in a vacuum. If you think about the most creative painters or musicians, they have been influenced by painters and musicians before them. Albert Einstein, one of the most creative minds in all of human history, if he didn't have Lorentz doing the Lorentz equations, if he didn't have Newton before him, if he didn't have the experimental data, it's unlikely that he would have made the same leaps that he made. So he had to be informed. Now, what he was able to do is form new connections with existing data that maybe other people might have gotten close, and he just connected that last little distance between the ideas. The current state-of-the-art AIs are still less complex than the human brain, but they're getting close. Within the next 5 years, we're going to have AIs that are arguably more complex than the human brain. It is an open question whether those AIs, if they're trained on existing human-created data, whether those will be able to transcend and do leaps that human beings aren't capable of. We will see. But I do say, and I make this argument in the book, that even if they're not, when I'm in a room with another creative person, it does not make me less creative. It usually makes me more creative. We riff ideas. You say, what about this? And I was like, oh, that's a great idea. What about that? There's a reason why we brainstorm together. And so AI as a thought partner, I have brainstormed with K-Migo. I have brainstormed ideas, and it has helped me. So I actually think it can be once again, it can amplify creativity as opposed to undermining it.
You also quote Francis Ford Coppola as saying, instead of having one Mozart over 500 years, we now have the possibility of having 1,000 Mozarts, 1,000 Einsteins, 1,000 Da Vincis. Do you agree with that?
What Francis is referring to is by using tools like Khan Academy and Khan Academy Enhanced with K-Migo, for every human Mozart that became Mozart, there were probably 500 who had the potential to, but didn't get the support, didn't have actors in their lives to help them drive their creativity, drive their skills. So when we're talking about one Mozart becoming 500, we're not talking about the other 499 being AIs. We're talking about the other 499 being the young girl in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan that no one let her access a quantum physics book, but if she had access to it, can be the next Einstein. That's who we're talking about. And that's what the goal of Khan Academy is. And we can amplify their creativity because they might not have someone in Kandahar who can riff with them about quantum physics. But now they will have at least an AI that they can riff with about quantum physics.
Well, turning to what I consider to be a clearly positive use case, I love your confession in the book that you say you're a bit of a Trekkie. And you talk about in Star Trek, the holodeck, where the crew was able to travel to ancient Rome and interact with Julius Caesar or have a conversation with Albert Einstein. And you write, I suspect that in a few years, a student will be able to put on a VR headset and have an experience pretty darn close to what the Star Trek universe didn't have until the 24th century. So this to me is very exciting. I would love to stroll down the streets of Rome with, Marcus Aurelius, or Florence with Leonardo da Vinci, and just experience these moments in history, right? And it does feel like that's coming.
It's actually now an engineering problem. Like, we're going to be able to build in the next few years. Honestly, the Apple, this first generation Apple Vision Pro, it's expensive, so it's not everyone can access it, but it's already good enough for this type of thing. And then you add to it GPT-4, GPT-5 being able to drive the dialogue, the voice of some of these characters. Yeah, it's going to be mind-blowing.
As we think about educating our kids for a future world with future job opportunities, it's helpful to know what these future job opportunities will be, right? It's like, what are we educating kids for? I mean, obviously, there are many benefits to education just for the sake of education, but I think we're all curious to know how the workforce is changing. You quote Bill Gates in the book, who's among your supporters, who says there's a confounding paradox, which is that it's becoming easier to learn, but it's not clear that we need to learn if AI can do everything, right? So I guess the question emerges, do we need to learn all these skills, and for the purpose of what future jobs?
Not only do I think we need to learn it, and I say this in the book, but I think we need to learn it better than ever. And the reason I say that is it's hard at this point to predict exactly how this is going to evolve in the workplace. But most jobs, in fact, we're already seeing it affect jobs like coding. We have engineers at Khan Academy who say because of these coding copilots, these AI-based coding copilots, they're 3 or 4 times more productive. Now, what I'm noticing is the engineers who are already great engineers are the ones who are seeing the 4x productivity. The ones who are maybe newer or struggling or didn't have as much mastery of the craft, they aren't seeing the productivity. Maybe they're getting a little bit better. Maybe they could kind of fake a little bit of being a better engineer than they were before, but they're not seeing the 3-4x productivity. So, and if you're a writer, what I am seeing is the people who are already great writers, whether it's a grant writer or proposal writer or a project plan writer, they're getting more gains from the AI than the people who weren't great writers to begin with. The people who weren't great writers to begin with, they could go to ChatGPT and get something, and they don't even know that that's a mediocre thing. They don't even know how to give it feedback to make it excellent. So I think we're in a world where most jobs are going to be managing AI tools. But unless you know the craft reasonably well or very well yourself, if you don't know how to put those pieces together, you're going to be at a huge disadvantage, because people aren't going to need someone who can write okay, someone who can code okay, someone who can make mediocre graphics. You're going to need someone who knows how to do what excellent looks like, has an excellent editorial sense, and then knows how to put tools together. And I would also say is more cross-disciplinary than ever before. In the book, I talk about this whole Screenwriters Guild strike. I thought was completely wrongheaded. It's the screenwriters who are trying to convince the producers not to use AI. It should have been the other way around. The production houses should be trying to get rid of the AI, because what's going to happen to a screenwriter who right now maybe captures less than 1% of the value of the movie, even though they kind of are the heart of the movie. If they know how to use these tools, they're going to be able to produce more and more of the movie themselves and not have to go through these gatekeepers, not have to raise $100 million. They're going to be able to do that movie for $100,000 or $10,000. So more power is going to accrue to them. The same way that, things like YouTube allowed a whole generation, including me, of people to publish.
Right.
Without and being discovered, me and Justin Bieber and others, right? As opposed to going through all of the gatekeepers. And I think this is just going to be dramatically more with artificial intelligence.
Right. And hopefully we'll have a lot more amazing movies as a result of this, right? Because you'll have all these, these individual screenwriters will be able to just do a lot more. I love this line you say, we're entering a world where we're going back to a pre-industrial revolution, craftsman-like experience. A small group of people who understand engineering, sales, marketing, finance, and design are going to be able to manage armies of generative AI and put all these pieces together.
100%. And, I think we're going to see 1,000 times as many bad movies, but that's also going to result with 100 times. It's like YouTube, right? YouTube has a lot more not so good content than we've ever had. But in that, there's actually probably, 10x or 100x good content than we've ever had.
In hiring for these future jobs, you describe the way that AI could be really empowering to the hiring process, both for the applicant and for companies that are looking for the best possible future members of their teams. And obviously, this immediately strikes terror in a lot of people, this idea that oh my gosh, AI is going to be going through the resumes. This is how dystopian. But you predict that it will be less biased and maybe surface better matchups between applicants and job opportunities.
Yeah, this goes back to my predictions in Computer World magazine back in 1999. You could have a world where every job applicant has an agent who can talk to every hiring manager that exists. I remember when I was in business school, this was in 2003, it was a tough job market, and I was student council president, and I remember the head of recruiting saying, I got this angry letter from this one CEO who put a job posting. This was in a tough job market where MBAs were having trouble getting really good jobs, and no one applied for this job. And it was a job, it was kind of, it was in the Midwest. It was for a company that made tractor equipment. It didn't look sexy to a bunch of kids at Harvard Business School, so no one applied to it. It turns out that it was a multi-billion-dollar company, and this CEO founder was looking for his heir, was looking for someone to hand the business over to become CEO. It was the best job that year. It was, and no one applied for it. But imagine a world where if the applicants were able to double click in a scalable way, and also the people hiring. I had the opposite problem coming out of business school. I decided I wanted to work at a hedge fund. I had zero background in hedge funds up to that point. I had a good resume for working in tech. I had a good resume for becoming maybe a venture capitalist or something. Tons of people just overlooked my resume until finally I found somebody at the last second to say, oh, I view that as a feature that you didn't have a background. It gave me a chance. But, I felt the other side of it, that hey, maybe if some of these other more traditional hedge funds had a chance to talk to me, they might have they might have double clicked on it a little bit more. So as long as it's well designed, you can test for bias, et cetera, it might create a lot more liquidity and fewer frictions than we have today in employment.
From LinkedIn News, I'm Leah Smart, host of Everyday Better, an award-winning weekly podcast dedicated to personal development. Whether you're looking for ways to shift your mindset or seeking more fulfillment in your life, we've got you covered.
You can build internal resources. That's what the study of psychology is about, building internal resources.
Turning towards is one of the most important elements of successful relationships, no matter what kind of relationship it is.
The thing that underpins all of this productivity stuff is finding a way to make the journey itself enjoyable. The journey is the destination.
The beauty of uncertainty is infinite possibility. When you don't know what's next, you don't know what's next. And thus, anything can be next.
Join me as we dive into captivating stories and research-backed ideas that have empowered me and others to lead lives with more clarity and intention. Everyday Better, making growth an everyday practice. Listen to Everyday Better on the LinkedIn Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Well, as a final question, as you know, some people think that we should slow down AI development or halt it altogether. And you say at one point in the book, honestly, even I find the pace of its development dizzying. If you had a magic wand that enabled you to either keep AI where it is today and just focused on really effective deployment of it. And I would argue that it could take us 10 years just to effectively employ the power of the AI that exists today versus kind of let it continue to develop at its current rapid pace. Which would you select? Would you have any hesitation there? It sounds like you're pro AI development.
Well, it depends if what that magic wand allows me to do. If I could slow down the bad actors too, outside of education, if I could slow down, authoritarian regimes from using it to spy on their people or creating or continuing their research in AI so that they potentially have better AIs than we do. If I could control that, I would. Now, that's not realistic. I won't be able to stop Putin's Russia from doing more research in AI. So that's where I feel like if we, and I'm talking outside of my education lane, I'm talking just from a national security point of view. If we say, hey, this is getting kind of scary, we have to slow it down. Well, guess what? The people that we are going to compete with militarily and economically are not going to slow down. There's nothing we can do to really make them slow down. I guess we're trying to withhold chips and things like that. But, that's going to create its own reasons for them to create their own chips. So from a national security point of view, economic point of view, I don't think we can afford to do that. As someone in the space, I kind of want a breather. Things are advancing so fast. But I think for the most part in education, as the AIs are getting better at voice, at listening, at multiple sensory input, et cetera, as long as the people who are driving it for students are thinking about it holistically, thinking about bias, I think it's a reasonably bright future. So it's tiring for sure. I wouldn't mind a break a little bit, but it's exciting and it is an exciting time to be alive. We are at an inflection point in society on multiple dimensions. AIs right now, everyone I talk to, robotics is going to be entering in the same phase.
Astounding.
Yeah, people don't realize even drones are scary. But they are already very relevant in what's going on in national security, et cetera. What's going on in biotechnology. We're in that inflection point, with CRISPR and modifying the human genome. So it is a wild time to be alive. But the march of progress for humanity, for the most part, it has ups and downs, and we have our really dark moments. But for the most part, it's increasing upwards. So I tend to be on the positive side of that. And I'd also say, look, I try to focus on what's under my control. There's no use for me to stress about what's outside of my control. In my control is I try to be the best person that I can be, try to be honest with myself when I'm not being a good person, and then try to put that positive intent to good action for hopefully as many people as possible. And I hope other people kind of take a similar mindset.
Well, you've chosen a great swim lane, and I think it's an incredibly exciting category for AI. I was really inspired by your book. I'm really grateful, Sal, for all you and your team is doing to advance education around the world. You write in your final sentences, let's use AI to create a new golden age for humanity, a time that will make today look like a dark age. Well, you're clearly hard at work doing this. So thank you for that, and thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Sal Khan is the founder of the Khan Academy and the author, most recently, of Brave New Words, How AI Will Revolutionize Education and Why That's a Good Thing. If you'd like to try out K-Migo, visit K-Migo.ai. That's K-H-A-N-M-I-G-O.ai. I recommend it. I'm loving it. Did you know that the Next Big Idea Club has its own AI? It's called Deep Reads, and it allows you to chat with and extract insights from our library of more than 1,200 book summaries based on the best new nonfiction. To access it, just download the Next Big Idea app from the Apple or Android App Store. Today's episode was produced by Caleb Bissinger, sound designed by Mike Toda. Our AI grading assistant gives the team at the LinkedIn Podcast Network an A+. I'm Rufus Griscom. See you next week.